The indicator on the pressure cooker was jury-rigged with a simple watch face. The second hand swept past the 12, then the 1, then the 2. It wasn't measuring time. It was an improvised altimeter, and it was climbing, fast. The flight from Amman was descending into Ben Gurion Airport, and the man in seat 14B felt the cabin pressure change. He glanced at the device in his carry-on. The needle, scavenged from a kitchen timer, was creeping towards a red line he'd painted himself. This was the trigger. Barometric, sophisticated, undetectable by a standard X-ray. He was one of three. 3 men on 3 different flights converging on Tel Aviv. Their luggage contained no metal, no military-grade explosives, just a benign-looking chemical precursor, separated into 2 inert compounds. One was a liquid absorbed into his clothing. The other was a powder, vacuum-sealed inside bags of coffee. Once mixed, they would create a binary explosive with the force of military C4. The plan, orchestrated by Hamas's new chief of operations, was brutally simple. The 3 men would pass through customs, collect their bags, and meet in the arrivals hall. There, they would mix the compounds in the public restroom. At precisely 18, during peak arrival time, they would detonate. The target wasn't an airplane. The target was the illusion of security itself. In a Shin Bet monitoring station buried deep beneath Tel Aviv, an analyst flagged an encrypted message intercepted hours earlier. The message was short, a burst of numbers transmitted from a burner phone in Ramallah. It meant nothing to the decryption algorithms. But it wasn't for the algorithms. It was for a man codenamed the Green Prince. The analyst forwarded the intercept to a single handler, Captain Loai. Gonen Ben Yitzhak, known as Loai to his assets, saw the numbers and felt a cold dread. It was a fail-safe code. A message Mossad Hassan Youssef was only supposed to use if a catastrophic attack was imminent and all other communication lines were compromised. The numbers weren't coordinates or times. They were a flight number. Gonen pulled up the flight manifest. Then he cross-referenced recent travel visas from Jordan. He found a name, then another, then a third. All young men with no prior records, all from the same village near Nablus. The pieces snapped together with sickening speed. He looked at the clock. 17:42. The first flight was already on final approach. He picked up a red phone that connected directly to the airport's director of security. There was no time for proof or debate. He had the word of one man, a man who was, officially, the enemy. A man whose father was the spiritual leader of the very organization trying to blow the airport off the map. Gonen's career, and the lives of hundreds of civilians, rested on the loyalty of the son of a Hamas founder. He gave the order, ground stop, everything, now. The story of that phone call, the story of the agent who made it possible, doesn't begin in an airport. It begins a decade earlier, in the crucible of the First Intifada. It begins with the players who would shape this secret war. First, the asset. Mossad Hassan Youssef, born 1978, Ramallah, eldest son of Sheikh Hassan Youssef. To understand the asset, you must understand the father. Sheikh Hassan Youssef was not just a militant. He was a cornerstone. A co-founder of Hamas in 1987, his power wasn't in weapons, but in words. His sermons, delivered in packed mosques across the West Bank, could mobilize thousands. When Israel deported 415 Hamas and Islamic Jihad leaders to Lebanon in 1992, he was among them. His time in that desolate tent city, broadcast across the world, cemented his status as a living symbol of Palestinian resistance. For Mossad, this was his entire world. He grew up in a house that was the de facto headquarters for Hamas in the West Bank. Men with guns and fervent eyes were his father's colleagues. The smell of printing ink from revolutionary pamphlets was the smell of his childhood. His first arrest came at age 10 for throwing stones at Israeli settlers. By his late teens, he was no longer a child throwing stones. He was buying weapons, not for terrorism, he would later claim, but for self-defense, a futile gesture of power in an occupied land. In 1996, he was caught. An Israeli patrol stopped his car. Under the seat, they found the firearms. He was taken to Mossad, Jerusalem's most notorious interrogation center. He expected pain. He expected humiliation. He did not expect an offer. Second, the handler, Gonen ben Yitzhak, recruited into the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, in the mid-1990s. His background was in law, a mind trained in logic and persuasion, not brute force. His superiors saw in him an unusual talent for psychological profiling. He could read people, find their fractures, their vanities, their hidden doubts. He was assigned to the Human Sources Division in the West Bank. His job title was Case Officer. His real job was to turn the enemy against itself. The operational environment was brutal. The Oslo Accords of 1993 had created a patchwork of control, areas A, B, and C. Palestinian Authority police controlled the cities, but Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, could roll in at any time. It was a pressure cooker. Hamas saw Oslo as a betrayal, a capitulation. They answered with a new, horrific weapon, the suicide bomber. Gonen's predecessors had failed to penetrate Hamas's upper echelons. The organization was built on family and clan loyalty. Informants were rare, and those who were turned were usually low-level operatives, quickly discovered and publicly executed by Hamas's internal security wing, the Mossad. Gonen's mission was to succeed where everyone else had failed. He needed a source so high up, so trusted, that they could map the entire organization from the inside. He needed a miracle. Third, the target, Yahya Ayyash, the engineer, a legend in Hamas. A quiet man with a degree in electrical engineering from Birzeit University. He was the architect of the suicide bombing campaign. He didn't just build bombs, he innovated. He perfected the use of triacetone triperoxide, or TATP, a high explosive that could be synthesized from common household chemicals, acetone, hydrogen peroxide, and sulfuric acid. It was volatile, unstable, but its ingredients could be bought at any pharmacy or hardware store, making it nearly impossible to track. His signature was the explosive belt, packed with nails, screws, and ball bearings to maximize civilian casualties. Between 1994 and 1996, Ayyash's devices killed over 100 Israelis in bus bombings, at crowded intersections, in shopping malls. He was Shin Bet's #1 target. He was a ghost, moving between safe houses, never sleeping in the same bed twice. Finding him was the intelligence community's highest priority. Every interrogation, every piece of signal intelligence was aimed at one goal: locating the engineer. The chessboard was soaked in blood. The hope that followed the 1993 Oslo Accords on the White House lawn had curdled into paranoia and violence. On February 25, 1994, an American-Israeli settler named Baruch Goldstein walked into the Ibrahimi Mosque at the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron and opened fire with his IDF-issued Galil rifle, killing 29 Palestinian worshippers and wounding 125. Hamas needed a response. Yahya Ayyash provided it. 6 weeks later, on April 6th, a car bomb exploded next to a bus in Afula, killing 8 Israelis. 1 week after that, another suicide bomber detonated on a bus in Hadara, killing 6. This was the new grammar of the conflict. An eye for an eye, a busload for a mosque. Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, a former general who had shaken Arafat's hand, found himself squeezed. The Israeli right called him a traitor. The Palestinian street saw him as an occupier in a diplomat suit. On November 4, 1995, after a peace rally in Tel Aviv, a right-wing Israeli extremist named Yigal Amir shot Rabin in the back, assassinating the architect of the peace process. The political vacuum was filled with explosions. This was the world Gonen ben Yitzhak inherited. Shin Bet was desperate. Their attempts to find Ayyash were failing. They had SIGINT, signals intelligence, but Ayyash was disciplined. He never used a phone himself. They had low-level informants, but these men knew nothing of the leadership's plans. They were blind at the strategic level. The mission genesis was born from this blindness. A directive came down from the head of Shin Bet himself. The old methods weren't working. A new strategy was required. Top-down penetration. They wouldn't work their way up from the street. They would find a way to insert an asset directly into the command structure. It was wildly ambitious, bordering on impossible. Hamas leadership was a closed circle. You were born into it, married into it, or you fought your way into it through years of proven loyalty and bloodshed. There were no shortcuts. The candidate profile was a phantom, someone with impeccable credentials, unquestioned access, but with a hidden vulnerability, a crack in their ideological armor that Shin Bet could exploit. They scanned lists of recent arrests, looking for a potential match. And then, a name appeared on a file. Mossad Hassan Youssef, son of the Sheikh, arrested for buying guns. It was a long shot, a Hail Mary, but it was the only shot they had. The interrogation of Mossad began as standard procedure. Sleep deprivation, uncomfortable positions, endless circular questions. The goal was to disorient and break him down. But Gonen, observing behind a one-way mirror, saw something different in the young man. Not the hardened fanaticism he was used to, but a swaggering arrogance, a youthful pride. He decided to change tactics. He entered the room, dismissed the other interrogators, and sat down. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He introduced himself as Captain Loai. He spoke to Mossad not as a prisoner, but as an equal. He asked him about his father, about his beliefs. He asked him about the hypocrisy he saw every day. Hamas leaders preach sacrifice, Gonen said, but their own sons live well. They call for martyrdom while they drive nice cars. Does that seem right to you? He was planting a seed. He knew Mossad wouldn't break and agree to work for him, so he made a different offer. Help us, and you'll be a prince in your own community. We will give you money, a car, influence. You can rise in the ranks and no one will be able to touch you. It was an appeal to ego, not ideology. To Mossad, it was a joke. He was the son of Sheikh Hassan Youssef. He despised the Shin Bet. But he saw an opportunity. He would pretend to cooperate. He would become a double agent, feeding the Israelis useless information while secretly working for Hamas, he agreed. Gonen knew Mossad was lying. The polygraph tests confirmed it. But that was part of the plan. Gonen wasn't recruiting an informant. He was beginning a conversion. Mossad was transferred from the interrogation center to a prison cell in Megiddo, a sprawling complex that housed hundreds of Palestinian security prisoners. This was the next stage of his recruitment. Gonen's theory was simple. The best argument against Hamas was Hamas itself. Inside Megiddo, Mossad's status as the son of the sheikh afforded him immediate respect. He was welcomed into the inner circle of the Hamas prisoners. They saw him as royalty. He saw them for what they were. The prison was a microcosm of Palestinian society, and Hamas ran its section with an iron fist. He watched as the Hamas leaders imposed their strict religious doctrine, punishing minor infractions with beatings. But it was their treatment of suspected collaborators that shattered his worldview. The Mossad, Hamas's internal police, operated a torture chamber in the prison's Block 10. They would haul in prisoners accused of spying for Israel. The accusations were often based on rumor or personal vendettas. The interrogations were medieval. Mossad saw men with their fingernails pulled out. He saw them burned with heated plastic. He saw one man, accused on the flimsiest of evidence, have a needle inserted under his nail and pushed all the way in. The man's screams echoed through the cell block for hours. Mossad had grown up believing Hamas were holy warriors, fighting for justice. In the prisons of Megiddo, he saw they were just gangsters, thugs who preyed on the weakest of their own people. The ideology he had been raised on crumbled into dust. He thought of Gonen's words about hypocrisy. This was it, in its most brutal form. He requested a meeting with his handler. When Gonen arrived, he saw a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, burning anger. "I will work with you," Mossad said, "but on one condition. All the intelligence I provide will be used to prevent attacks and save lives. No assassinations, no targeted killings. I will not be responsible for another man's death." Gonen agreed. This was the birth of the Green Prince. Green for the color of the Hamas flag, Prince for his lineage. The first test came quickly. A Hamas cell on the outside was planning a car bombing at an IDF checkpoint. The information came to the Hamas leadership in the prison for their blessing. Mossad learned the target, the type of car, and the time. It was his first real piece of actionable intelligence. He had to get the message to Gonen. Contact was sporadic and dangerous. He feigned a medical emergency, a stomach ailment, to get a visit to the prison clinic. There, he was able to have a brief, unmonitored conversation with a Shin Bet officer posing as a medical assistant. He passed the details. 2 days later, the IDF stopped the car. The bomb was defused. The attack was prevented. No one was killed. Gonen had kept his word. Trust was established. A few months later, Mossad was released from prison. Gonen's parting instruction was simple. Go to your father. Be his son, and listen. Mossad returned to Ramallah a hero. A young man who had endured an Israeli prison and not broken. He became his father's right-hand man. He drove him to meetings, sat in on strategy sessions, and typed his letters. He was invisible, the loyal son, the chauffeur, and he was listening. The intelligence began to flow. At first, it was simple. Names of new recruits, locations of weapons caches, financial transactions. For communication, Gonen provided him with a Nokia 5110. It was a standard civilian phone, but with a modification. The battery had been hollowed out to conceal a second encrypted SIM card provided by Shin Bet. The protocol was strict. Mossad was to only turn on the phone for 5 minutes at a specific, pre-arranged time twice a week. He would go to a high place, like a rooftop, to ensure a clear signal. He would send a coded text message. "The patient's fever is high," meant a high-level meeting was scheduled. "I am visiting my uncle" meant he was traveling to a specific city. Gonen also supplied him with a pager. It could only receive numbers. A code of 111 meant abort a planned meeting. 999 was an emergency signal to activate the secret phone immediately. This technology was a lifeline, but it was also a constant source of tension. Batteries could die, signals could fail. Hamas was becoming increasingly sophisticated in its counterintelligence. They ran regular electronic sweeps, looking for unauthorized transmissions. Every time Mossad turned on that phone, he was risking exposure and a brutal death. The primary target remained Yahya Ayyash. The engineer was a phantom, and the pressure to find him was immense. In late 1995, Shin Bet got a break, not from Mossad, but from another source. They tracked Ayyash to the Gaza Strip, a hornet's nest where an IDF raid was impossible. They learned he was staying in the home of a man named Osama Hamad, a former Hamas activist. The problem was communication. Ayyash was paranoid. He never used a phone himself. He would only speak to his father, who would call him on Osama Hamad's cell phone. The Shin Bet had the number. An assassination by missile strike was considered, but the risk of collateral damage was too high. They needed a more precise method. The plan was audacious. They approached Kamil Hamad, Osama's uncle. They used a combination of blackmail and bribery to force his cooperation. They gave him a brand new cell phone, identical to his nephew's, and told him to give it to Osama as a gift. This phone, however, had a secret. Shin Bet's technical division had embedded a tiny 5-gram RDX explosive charge into the battery. It was just powerful enough to kill the person holding it to their ear. The trigger was not a timer, but a specific audio frequency that would be broadcast from a nearby surveillance aircraft. On January 5th, 1996, the trap was set. Ayyash's father called. Osama Hamad answered and handed the phone to his guest. Ayyash began speaking. High above, an Israeli surveillance plane broadcast the trigger frequency. The phone detonated. The engineer was dead. The assassination was a major victory for Shin Bet. But for Mossad and Gonen, it created a new set of problems. Hamas was wounded and vengeful. They launched a series of retaliatory suicide bombings in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv that killed more than 50 civilians. And more importantly, they became pathologically paranoid about security. The hunt for moles began in earnest. Mossad's position became exponentially more dangerous. He was now operating in an environment where any slip-up, any unusual behavior, could be a death sentence. His father, Sheikh Youssef, was rearrested in the crackdown following the bombings. This paradoxically made Mossad even more valuable. With his father in prison, Mossad became the primary point of contact for the Hamas network on the outside. He was no longer just the chauffeur. He was the conduit to the spiritual leader. His access was unprecedented. He was meeting with cell leaders, weapons smugglers, and bomb makers. To capture the details of these meetings, Gonen provided him with new technology, a car key fob with a pinhole microphone and a solid-state recorder. The audio quality was poor, and it had to be within a few feet of the target to be effective. During one critical meeting with a senior Hamas military commander, Mossad had to strategically place his keys on a coffee table, aiming the pinhole directly at the man's mouth while appearing casual. He could hear the faint whir of the recording mechanism and was certain everyone else could too. His heart pounded in his chest for the entire 30-minute meeting. The recording he produced was a gold mine. It detailed a plan to smuggle in a new shipment of explosives from the Sinai. Gonen's team used the information to intercept the shipment at the border. Another attack was thwarted. But the successes created more pressure. A major setback occurred in 2001. Hamas had established a secret bomb-making laboratory in a residential apartment building in Nablus. Mossad identified the location. The intelligence was passed to the IDF. A military unit was tasked with raiding the building. However, a rival intelligence agency, Military Intelligence, Amman, had its own source who provided conflicting information about the layout of the apartment. The resulting confusion led to a delayed and disorganized raid. The Hamas operatives inside were alerted. A massive firefight erupted, and a huge explosion tore through the building as the bomb makers detonated their own supply. Several IDF soldiers were killed, along with the Hamas cell. The failed raid was a catastrophe. Hamas's internal security immediately began an investigation. How did the Israelis know about the lab? The leak had to have come from someone with knowledge of the Nablus operations. Suspicion fell on Mossad. He had recently met with one of the men in the lab. He was brought before a Hamas tribunal. This was the ultimate loyalty test. They questioned him for hours. They accused him directly. "You are the spy." Mossad knew that denial was useless. He had to deflect. He used a technique Gonen had taught him, controlled confession. He admitted to being careless. He admitted that the Israelis might have been tailing him without his knowledge. He feigned shame and incompetence. "I am my father's son," he said, "but I am not a military man. I made a mistake. Punish me for my stupidity, but not for treason." He then provided them with a piece of pre-planned disinformation Gonen had prepared for just such a contingency. He gave them the location of a supposed low-level informant, a real person, but one who had no actual connection to Shin Bet. The Majd, eager for a scapegoat, took the bait. The innocent man was arrested and tortured. Mossad was exonerated. He had survived, but at a cost. He had sacrificed an innocent man to save himself. The moral lines were becoming increasingly blurred. The pressure was relentless. Gonen saw the toll it was taking on his asset. Mossad was losing weight, becoming paranoid. The handler-asset relationship deepened into something more complex. Gonen became Mossad's therapist, his confessor, his only link to a sane world. He would arrange meetings in safe houses in Jerusalem, not just to debrief, but to allow Mossad to decompress. He brought him books, music, anything to remind him of a life outside the conflict. This relationship was unorthodox and risky. Gonen's superiors worried he was becoming too emotionally involved. But Gonen knew that Mossad's psychological stability was the most critical component of the entire operation. If the Green Prince broke, the intelligence flow would stop, and more bombs would go off. The operation had to continue. The stakes were getting higher. The Second Intifada had erupted in late 2000, and the West Bank was a war zone. Suicide bombings were a weekly, sometimes daily occurrence. Mossad was now at the very heart of Hamas's operational command, identifying and locating the masterminds behind the attacks. He provided the intelligence that led to the arrests of Ibrahim Hamed, the commander of Hamas's military wing in the West Bank, and Abdullah Barghouti, a master bomb maker responsible for dozens of attacks, including the Sbarro Pizzeria bombing in Jerusalem. Every success, however, tightened the net around him. Hamas knew they had a major leak in their leadership. The hunt for the mole was constant and merciless. Mossad was living on a knife's edge, a breath away from discovery. The apex arrived in the spring of 2002. The IDF had launched Operation Defensive Shield, a massive military incursion into the West Bank aimed at dismantling the terrorist infrastructure. Ramallah was under siege. Tanks patrolled the streets, and a strict curfew was in effect. Sheikh Hassan Youssef was, once again, a primary target for arrest. But Mossad learned of something far more significant. In the chaos of the incursion, a senior Hamas cell was planning a spectacular attack. They believed the IDF was overstretched, and security in Israel proper would be lax. Mossad was summoned to a secret meeting in a basement beneath a butcher shop in Ramallah's old city. The air was thick with the smell of stale blood and gunpowder. The cell leader, a man named Marwan Barghouti, no relation to the bomb maker, laid out the plan. It was a multi-pronged attack on Jerusalem, scheduled to take place in 48 hours. A car bomb would detonate outside a central bus station to draw in first responders. Then, 2 suicide bombers on foot would infiltrate the chaos and detonate themselves among the police and medics. It was designed for maximum carnage. Mossad sat, nodding, his face a mask of calm. Inside, his mind was racing. He had to get this information out. But how? The city was locked down. The cell phone network was unreliable. His Nokia was useless. The pager was a one-way system. Any attempt to leave the meeting would arouse immediate suspicion. He was trapped. He had one last resort. A device Ghanen had given him months ago for a worst-case scenario. It was a small, flat transponder the size of a credit card, sewn into the lining of his leather jacket. It was a single-use item. Once activated, it would broadcast a short, encrypted data burst containing its GPS coordinates to a Shin Bet listening post. It was an emergency signal, a panic button. But using it was a tremendous risk. The signal, while brief, could potentially be detected by Hamas's own surveillance teams. And once activated, the device was useless. He would be burning his final lifeline. As the meeting concluded, Mossad knew he had only one chance. He needed a reason to be alone, just for a moment. He complained.